computer. All right, I'm Bruce McGee. Stephen will be hopefully joining us momentarily, and we're here today with Clint Bruce. Welcome, Clint.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. I appreciate it.
And I am going to make your video the one that records so you can do your show and tell. Yes, now I can see you. Would you please tell us the name of your book, and for our YouTube listeners, show us the book and tell us just a little bit about what it's about and where people can get it.
Absolutely. So this volume is entitled, I'm going to try to make the whole cover visible. It's entitled Afro Creole Poetry in French from Louisiana's Radical Civil War Era Newspapers. It is published by the historic New Orleans collection, a venerable and mighty institution located in the French Quarter devoted to research and Louisiana heritage.
Well, and one nice thing about the HNOC, they have some very beautiful bound, beautiful illustrated books. So do you have illustrations in yours as well, or?
Absolutely. That was one of the aspects of the HNOC's publication division that drew me to them. They've published books of maps, furniture, art books. So while mine is a text-based project because it's, it brings together poems and my translations, there are some nice graphic elements, and there are period illustrations as well and photographs.
I was about to ask you if there were any photos of the poets.
So we did not track down any photos of the poets. I did try, and I think I may have located one or two on Ancestry.com, but we could never verify them. Right. There are photographs of the folks who were involved in the newspapers in which the poems were published.
I have heard that all the photos of Homer Plessy are actually Governor Pinchback, and somehow the two got crossed-wired. We don't actually have any verified pictures of Plessy. I don't know, are you familiar with Naam, that book, Our History? And they do a lot of the Lesnells and put in some of their poetry into the book.
Yes, so the volume you're referring to was by a late 19th century civil rights activist, Rodolphe Dedunes, who wrote a community history of the Creole community of color that was published in French, written and published in French in 1911, and that is one of the sources for my research in the lengthy, I will say, weighty introduction to Afro Creole poetry. It's about a 70-page book within a book.
Man, that's really good for tenure time.
Exactly.
We don't care about how many poems you found. How many?
Is he the guy that preserved the poem that may have been written by a free man of color who is a defender of New Orleans during the Battle of New Orleans?
Yeah, I think that's the first poem in the book, if I recall.
That poem is not in my book. So in my book, in Dedunes, yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps, yes. It's called La Campagne de 1814-1815, and it is a really stirring work by an anonymous author who has a pen name, as some of the writers in this volume also have pen names, for whom we were not able to track down the identity, but some I have as well.
It amounts to 19th century protest poetry.
Yeah, exactly. Doesn't he say they call us monsters? Do I remember that correctly? In French, of course. But,
correct, referring to the prejudices of the time, even among citizens who had defended the state in the Battle of New Orleans.
Right. There was, I think, in the if I'm saying that right, Our Men and Our History in the. Oh, and by the way, folks, we do have, since that book is in public domain, we do have a copy of it on our website for free.
Excellent.
You can look over, and we're trying to expand our French resources, but we use a lot of student groups, and I'm kind of hampered by, if there's a student who speaks French in class, then work on this French stuff. And a lot of times then they still don't want to.
Right.
They're a little afraid of it. But, we have people at Tech whose first language is French. And when one of them shows up in class, Main Mundi translated the Black Marseillaise into English for us, as well as working on putting up the French version. And I don't know, is that one in your book?
It is. So it was published in one of the two newspapers, which are the Union, L'Union, and the New Orleans Tribune,
Right.
during the 1860s, which is the time period, very specific time period that Afro Creole poetry, the title, that's the shortened title. I will use that as the shortened title of the book. The very specific time period is the second half of the Civil War and the early years of Reconstruction.
And just a couple of months ago for Black History Month, we talked to the guy whose grandfather was editor, and Stephen was asking him about the very stuff you're putting in your book. And he had mostly focused on the political and social and had not really looked into the literature that was in those newspapers. But he said there was such literature. Now here you are to answer the question a few months later about what is that literature. I would like
it seems to track with the English speaking papers where they would produce or they would publish poetry and a lot of times some short fiction too. You would have maybe Dickens did this. Charles Dickens actually published entire novels that they would serialize over a period of weeks.
Right.
Yes, that was a pretty common feature of 19th century Louisiana French papers, and I've done some other projects on prose works as well. They didn't tend to be as long as Dickens, but there were some longer works that were published, especially later in the 19th century, as y'all know.
I wanted to ask, did you find what was the earliest newspaper of any kind in New Orleans? We've been trying to track that down and have not had much luck.
So my understanding has always been that the very earliest paper was published in 1794 by an exilee from Saint-Domingue named Louis Duclos, who published Le Moniteur de la Louisiane. And
the Monitor.
That is what I've always heard and read in published research. However, published research doesn't always get it right. So there may have been an earlier publication, but I don't think so. And I believe there are some issues of Le Moniteur online. It's not a source I've consulted extensively as I have with mid-19th century newspapers.
And I had heard, one of our earlier guests told us, and I found it hard to believe, but it tracks what you're saying, Louisiana did not have a printing press until somebody brought one from Saint-Domingue.
Exactly.
What's the date? I'm going to see if that date matches up with a date from the 30s. What do you have for a date for that, roughly? For that press? For the press.
The Monitor.
Yeah, for the printing press. Do you have a date for the printing press when it's first brought to Louisiana?
Well, that's a good question. I would need to check on that because in some of my historical research, I've seen documents that were printed under the Spanish government, I think a little earlier, but I'd always heard that the first sort of newspaper press was brought from Saint-Domingue. Now, whether there was a governmental sort of simpler model, that would need to be checked on, and I wouldn't venture to
There's one. The reason I was asking, there's one that we found in a book, and it seems to be attested. It's 1768.
Okay.
So that's why I find it so. I mean, this is at the dawn of the Spanish period, so I find it really puzzling that there's not a paper for a generation. You think about it, really a little over a generation. There's not a paper.
If it was an official printing press of the Spanish government, they might have just put out broadsheets to hang on posts and stuff.
They did that, but they did some books too. There's an article somewhere online that talks about that, and the book, what it does, it's the idea of the book is actually kind of ingenious. It looks at the dates and then the early print culture of when the printing presses first made it to American cities. So New Orleans is one of the cities profiled. Sure. And so they're relatively late. I mean, because you'd think that this makes sense. The American cities that would get printing presses earlier would be like cities you would expect, like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, etc. Maybe Charleston. But New Orleans is so late. I mean, it's literally right before the revolution breaks out.
Right.
And so then again, another generation later is when you get, this first newspaper coming along. So there's a big gap. They were printing books in between there too, not just broadsides, not just pamphlets, but books.
Our copy of the Code Noir was printed somewhere else and then brought to Louisiana. So I don't know if there was a home, created, but the one we have was, I think, written for Saint Domingue and then brought to Louisiana when they founded this colony. I wanted to find out a little bit more about you. So what university are you teaching at? I believe it's in Nova Scotia, or as we like to call it, Acadia.
Absolutely. So I hold the Canada Research Chair. It's a position funded by the federal government in Acadian and transnational studies, meaning that I study the Acadian diaspora, but I also have a background in Louisiana studies, hence this project. And the name of the institution is one that's pretty well known in French language circles in Louisiana. It is Université Sainte-Anne. We are largely appreciated in Louisiana for the French immersion programs that usually take place during the spring and the summer. They haven't, of course, since 2019 because of the ongoing pandemic, but over 1,000 people have come over the years, over the past few decades, from Louisiana: teachers, musicians, regular folks, teenagers, older people as well, to either perfect their French or to start learning it. So we're largely known for that, but we are a full-fledged university with programs in the sciences, business administration, social sciences and humanities, which is my department. And since 2017, we have a master's program in Francophone cultures and spaces, culture et espace francophone. We have between 10 and 12 students who are doing research projects, and I have 4 or 5 working under my supervision.
I'm glad y'all are doing that. It seems like a lot of, even in Louisiana, the French programs focus on French literature from France. And, some years ago, Centenary started the Tintamar. Is that how you say that?
I'm originally from Shreveport, and I was one of the founding students, and I'm still on the committee of Édition Tintamar.
Tell us about that then. We've always
Absolutely.
wanted to learn more about it, and just never, the cobbler's son has no shoes. We're 60 miles from Shreveport, and we haven't done an episode on that. So,
well, there's plenty of material for the podcast in Louisiana, that is for sure.
Right.
So I had the good fortune to study under Dr. Dana Kress, who at that time was the only professor of French. There are now 2. And Dr. Kress was trained in 19th century French literature, and he studied under a well-known specialist of Baudelaire at Vanderbilt University. However, when he came to Centenary in the early 90s, he started to get interested in local culture, of course, and to see what links there were between his training and what had been produced in Louisiana. And he realized that there was a lot more in the archives and in newspapers than had been reprinted in earlier anthologies. So the Tintamar initiative that you just alluded to started out as a website, which is still there. And I was one of the students who was typing up texts and writing short explanatory essays. And around 2003, it became the publishing house, which you also alluded to. And we've published over 50 books. Many of them are...
If you are at all interested in Louisiana Francophone literature, which is French language literature, or Creole, you must go to that website and start, a lot of it's available for free online, but also as books. And these are very nice books. They're done as a kind of series. They're all the same size and have kind of the same design scheme so that you know that they're part of a set.
Absolutely. And one of the goals with Tintamar, and I'll compare that to my book from the Historic New Orleans collection, one of the goals is to produce relatively inexpensive editions. So they usually go between $13. Maybe the most expensive is $30, but not many get that expensive. So the hardback from the Historic New Orleans collection, I'll hold it up again, it runs for $40, which, given the paper quality and all that, is still low compared to a lot of academic titles. I have
For a book
colleagues.
with pictures,
Right.
I was looking at an academic book on Louisiana last night, and it's $70. And I said, I gotta wait on that.
Absolutely. I find that LSU Press and UL Press tend to have pretty decent prices. And I'm not at all knocking the quality, but some of the other academic publishers, Mississippi's, that do fine works. You're better off maybe getting from the library than purchasing your own, unless you've got a
It's
decent
true.
book.
The cost can be pretty prohibitive, particularly if you're a student.
Right.
And because I've told my students before, if you're going to graduate school, particularly, and even undergrad college, but if you're going to graduate school, you need to hold on to the books in your major, because those are all considered reference books.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying that somebody with partly a background in library science as well as literature, but I mean, they need to hold on to those books as references. But again, it can get, if you start buying those things willy-nilly, it gets really, really expensive.
Well, since the pandemic, of course, I have a professor's salary, but since the pandemic began, and at one point our library services were a little hard to access. It's gotten a lot better since then, but I spent hundreds of dollars just to keep my research going.
Oh, my shelf is so heavy with Louisiana books at this. We've been doing this 9 years. You've been doing this longer than us. What year did you say the Tintamarre started?
So I graduated from a very good high school. I'll give you a little more background about myself. Caddo Parish Magnet High School in Shreveport, which had a fantastic languages program. Listen, there are not too many public high schools that have, and I'm going to go through them, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Latin, Russian, and at that time, Japanese over video conference.
There are not many colleges that have.
Right, exactly. Until you get into a big university. So I had the good fortune of having two excellent French teachers from Belgium who came through Code de Phil in the 70s or 80s, and it went up to French 5. So I read, we read Camus, we read Flaubert in my senior year. It's pretty heavy stuff, and that set me up to really spring into advanced coursework at Centenary. So I began Centenary in the fall of 1997, and Tintamarre, the publishing house, got going right after I graduated, but because I was so heavily involved with Tintamarre, the website, that had already linked me in.
Yeah, when did the website start? Because we were pleasantly surprised to find such a good resource for French and Creole material.
Around 2000, and the original idea that Dr. Kress had when he had several of us retyping texts to put on the website was that someone could teach a Louisiana Lit class, well, let's say a unit or even a whole class. So there are, in my book, there are 79 poems in my book from the 1860s, from the Union and the Tribune.
That's suitable for a textbook.
Right, absolutely. And a couple of them were on Tintamarre and have been in earlier anthologies, a couple of other published anthologies, certainly not most of them. So Tintamarre tried to get a broad range of fairly well-known novels like Mercier's L'Habitation Saint-Hubert, some of the poems from
the series.
Exactly. To give really the broad range, some Creole folk tales. You're familiar with the content.
Yes. We slowly are putting those on our website. And
Great.
Oddly enough, students that have no French or Creole will snap up one of those stories to transcribe, because, we've got the Creole, then we've got the English, and it's just a matter of checking spelling and inserting special characters. And I'm sure at some point you could do that in your sleep.
Sure.
How to make acute on a web page. It's not a simple matter.
Well, one of the questions that people often ask out of curiosity is whether there were poems written in the Creole language in the two newspapers, and if any of the poems are in Creole, and there are not. There are not. Um, that tended to be a trend that was taken up more by white local color writers after the
Right.
Civil War, and the men. There may be one or two women with pen names, with pseudonyms, nom de plume, but I don't think so. The men who published literary works in the Tribune and in the Union were um, were very well educated in the French language and in French intellectual traditions, and also I
Many
would
were
say
educated in
absolutely.
France, so their
And I would say
French was.
also Afro-Caribbean
Mhm.
Francophone Caribbean intellectual traditions. So Creole would have been a language with which they were familiar. Some of them may have spoken in childhood, certainly in the city of New Orleans and surrounding parishes, but it was not a language they considered one for literary production.
Right.
So that's something that can be a little misleading with the title. So the Afro Creole refers to their ethno-racial identity. It's not a term used that they used themselves. It's a term that later scholars have used, and it does not refer to the language of the writings.
Right.
Does their French education track with being more well-to-do elements of society, you think, or they've got their families are a little bit better heeled, so they can send the kids over to France to be educated, or
So there is a perception, and it's not entirely false. So I'll give a couple of examples here that free people of color who were Creoles were all part of an elite class, and there were certainly people who had we'll say relative advantages, such as the founder of l'Union and la Tribune, Dr. Louis Charles Roudanet, whose descendant Marc
Right.
Roudanet you interviewed
right?
a few weeks
Mhm.
ago. That was certainly not the case for all of the community, and it was not even the case for all of the folks who were writers. Many of them came from much more modest backgrounds, and education was viewed in that respect as a means of social uplift and social mobility. So it's hard to paint with broad strokes. There are historical studies that show that free people of color were certainly less well off in general than their white counterparts, and you
Mhm.
can't judge the entire several thousands person community simply by their most affluent members.
So it is kind of a mix, you think, as far as the profile of those writers, then, or
Absolutely. I mean, they all had education, and that
Mhm.
shines through in the poetry. They master
Right,
poetic
right.
form. Many of them were teachers at a well-known school for children of color,
Oh,
um,
okay.
and located in Faubourg Marigny. And they gravitated around the school that was called the Catholic Institute for Indigent Orphans, or the Couvent School. So you'll find it's referenced in a lot of works on 19th century New Orleans. And that school was sort of like Centenary College in the early 2000s. I'm joking here, but it was kind of a hotbed of intellectual activity in the Creole community.
And there was, especially during the Civil War, the Creoles, according to Mr. Rudnay, had to make a choice. Do we remain distinct from the freed slaves? And because it had been kind of a half caste, if you will, you had the slaves, you had the white people, and they fit, not very, like somewhere in between. And so is our education, are we going to open it up to everybody and mix in with these kids, that are coming from that background, the freed slave? But before the Civil War, they had to, kind of make their own way. They couldn't go to school with the white kids, so they had to set up schools for themselves.
Absolutely. And so what I would then add to those very relevant observations is that theme of throwing their lot in with the cause of the former enslaved population is a major thematic element in the poetry, and really taking on a Black identity. And I would
Right.
I would argue, and I say very explicitly in the introduction, quoting from some other scholars as well. So I want to give folks, folks their due, folks like Shirley Thompson and before her Caroline Center, pointing out that the poetry, many of the poems, certainly not all of them, are identity statements that say this is who we are in this specific context, and we will fight for our rights and for the rights of others who have been downtrodden. That's a major theme in the poems. So Mr. Roudenet's observation, which he bases on a lot of the readings of editorials and news reports, but he's really, I follow him on Facebook. He's very interested in the editorials in the two papers, but it's
Right.
that is borne out very strongly in the poetry.
I want to go back to that school because it sounds as though it was almost the nexus of that community, of the Treme community. So I'm wondering how long that school survived and who might have been some of the more famous alums that graduated.
Sure.
Do you know much about it as far as that goes?
So I am not the Paramount expert, but I will certainly share what I know based on my research for this project and some other readings. So it was located in Faubourg Marigny, so next to Treme, next to the French Quarter.
Okay, next to it. Okay.
And you are absolutely right. It was certainly one of the major nodes for the Creole community, the Creole activist community. And my understanding, and it would be easy just to go look up if I weren't having a conversation, is that sort of the descendant of the school lasted into the early 20th century. And as far as the alums, so I mostly know folks who were activists in the community of color in the 19th century, some of whose names you'll find you'll find in the book. So I don't know who's considered sort of famous on whose J-Lo didn't go there and didn't go there, but certainly
but
people
they would have
who
been well known. They would have been well known in the New Orleans area, I would assume.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I believe NOCA, CCA, which is the local art school, I think they're in the Marigny now. So some level the tradition continues. Of course, they're all in English. And that brings me to a stupid question I forgot to ask earlier. Your material, is it all French? Or are you giving the French and then translating it? Because that'll help decide who buys the book.
It will, absolutely. So I'm going to talk for a minute about what folks will find when they open up the book. We'll say in the middle, in what is really the heart and main body of its content. So they will find on the left-hand side, they will find French language poems in verse, of course, cut up into stanzas. We pretty much kept the structure as they appeared in the newspapers. And on the right, they will find my English translations also in English verse, generally following the rules of English poetry, largely rhyming, although I didn't use rhyme as a straitjacket. So they will, unlike what you may find in other translations that may take a more free verse approach, for very specific reasons that I can discuss here, and I certainly discuss in the book, the poems are translated as poems with following conventions of meter and prosody in English, and largely following rhyme schemes as well.
Well, that way you get a feel for the fact that it is poetry. And that's one of the difficult choices people make when they make a translation of poetry. Do I go for a prose, which is a little more literal, or do I try to make it, poetic? So that you get a feel, at least this is a poem.
That's also very astute, and I'm gonna just run with that for a minute, with a couple of my own reflections that folks can also find in my translator's essay. It was very important for these writers of partial African descent, of African background, to demonstrate that they mastered codes of writing, that they mastered elements of poetics, to show their intellectual qualities, right? And to produce
and their imaginative ability too, I would assume.
Absolutely.
They have to prove their bona fides at every turn. And so the intellect and the imagination both have to be kind of marshaled for the project that they've, put together.
All of that is terribly relevant. And so I needed to produce translations that convey that experience. So that's one element that I needed to produce translations that show, hey, these were good poets writing good poetry according to rules of form. The other aspect to this is that I did want to establish some distance between us and the poems. So I thought, well, when a current day French speaker in the 2010s, when I was translating 2020, 21, when they read the original French, what is it like for them? Well, it's not like reading Shakespeare. It's not like reading, back into the 17th century, but it doesn't read like French poetry today. So I didn't want to do an updated modernist translation, which could be a really great approach as well. Um, I wanted to get the sense that you were reading something from the 19th century because it was so embedded in that time and place. So
Mhm.
those were a couple of my guiding principles. So sometimes when I was looking for a turn of phrase, I would go into Google Books or other documents and say, well, does this English turn of phrase, is it found in 19th century texts? And I didn't use this as a crutch, but I would sometimes use it to check when I was coming up with my own um, with my own turns of phrase. And oftentimes I would find maybe popular poetry or hymns that would use a similar expression and say, okay, the 19th century resounds in this. So there's a lot of thought put into that.
You're practicing something Bruce and I learned in biblical studies, and I don't know if they still use this term now, but they used to call it dynamic equivalence when you do
Yes,
translation, translating the
absolutely.
idea as much as you are the literal word. And there's a term for that too, but it's translating the words versus translating the ideas. And to me, it's a false choice. We ought to do both.
Well, and I
You know,
certainly
it's
attempt
like a
to.
good marriage in a way.
So sometimes I will say, and I'll explain here, that anybody so say someone reads French and reads English, like I think you do, Bruce, you can follow along side by side and you'll get a fairly literal sense. But at some point, there came a time when if I kept going literally, it would stop working. And
Mhm.
so I had to then find another way to express the idea. So for the most part, you can kind of follow along. But something else I wanted to say about quote unquote literal translations is that they're not really, and what you were saying, Stephen, is right. It is a false choice because sometimes in works by scholars who have taken little excerpts from these poems. So scholars have gone into the newspapers and said, oh, this poem, some in my book, talks about this topic, and I want to share that in my article or in my manuscript. And they've done very literal translations of the poem. So they don't really read like poems.
Right.
What I tended to find is that those very little translations are also often accompanied by very basic mistakes in French translation, completely getting a word wrong, so that the over literalist is also handicapped by misunderstanding the French, not in such a way that renders their article invalid or anything like that, but thinking, well, that word actually really doesn't mean that, and it certainly doesn't mean it here. So over literal can kind of come back and bite you, and you need someone who has enough knowledge of French to do both, as you were saying,
A lot
Stephen.
of the idioms, translating idioms, and I saw a really sarcastic and yet rather wise observation about some of these translations, that they were more wooden than a casket, or
Okay.
or more
Yes.
wooden than Al Gore, which also
Oh,
sort of
that's funny.
applies.
Yeah.
And
That's
so,
funny.
but it's true. I mean, it can be so wooden, it's stilted, it's mechanical. It saps all the life out of the original work, and it
And that
winds up
wouldn't
being this exercise in just mechanism almost. It's dead.
that wouldn't be such a problem for, I'd say, an historian who's using a short quote. But when I find sort of mistakes in vocabulary, it's like, hey,
Hmm.
actually that really doesn't mean that. So what I hope is that certain people who want to quote from these poems, if they find that my translation at times deviates a little too much from the literal sense of a certain line, they could adjust it. They could say, hey, Clint Bruce translates it as this, but it more literally means this, and then
You've
it
got
would
the
be
original right across the page. So,
exactly. So
well,
that's a way
you're
that
reminded,
scholars could use it.
you've been giving me flashbacks to my days in the seminary. There was this version of the English Bible called the American Standard Version, which one of the earlier reviewers said, good Greek bad English.
That's hilarious, right?
And
Right.
so we all bought it because it was very wooden, literal translation. And there's nothing like, translating a verse and then just sitting there looking at this word hash and saying, well, I called the words, but it doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely.
We've all had that experience if we've done any translation. I'm better at those ancient languages than French. I'm trying to bring my French level up, but I would need a book like yours as opposed to just all French. And anybody that's familiar with the Loeb Classical Library, the book sounds like it's basically in that format. Original language on the left, translation on the right.
It's one of those parallel texts that we used to see in seminary, Bruce. Where you have the Greek, it's the Koine text is on the left, and the English text or German text or whatever your native language is on the right.
Now,
And I saw that literally last night, watching a trailer for a movie that's about to be released. It's the date will mean nothing to the listeners until I tell you what came out of this period, but it's called 1946, and it's about the mistranslation of a couple of words in the Greek Testament that give us what we today, at least, or it comes into the New Testament as the word homosexuality.
Right.
And it talks about basically the mistranslation of that word out of two different words in the Greek. And I had heard this when I was a student at Harvard Divinity, but I actually saw it last night for the very first time. I saw a panel of the translators sitting around a table, and they had their hands raised. And what they would do, and I'd heard this from one of our professors in one of my Greek classes, when they were trying to translate a particular word or phrase or sentence, what they would do is, if there was some sort of controversy about it, they would literally take a vote, and the majority vote won. That is to say, whichever group thought that it should come down on the side of being translated one way, and they had the most votes, frankly, that's the way they had translated. And I actually saw that in an old black and white photo last night. These hands were up, and that's what they were doing. They were taking votes on various words and phrases.
Democracy in action, for though perhaps not
and it winds up, it's a choice. I mean, it is a choice that the scholars make to translate a word a particular way or a phrase a particular way.
Of course.
Stephen, was that catafusis against nature, as the old translations say?
Arsenicae. I can't remember. That was one of the words, and there was another word too. But anyway, it was the word that they combined two different words to give us, this word homosexuality, which, by the way, doesn't appear in the Koine text.
Right.
It doesn't appear anywhere in the Koine text.
Well, that's our Greek lesson for the day.
Yes, this is our New Testament lesson for the day. Yeah.
I wanted to get you to read one of your poems and then the translation, just to give us a feel for it. Then I want to talk about your research, how you went about finding this.
Absolutely. So, I think that. So, would you like me to choose a poem, a shorter one?
Please, your choice.
Absolutely. So, I need to look it up. I'm going to choose the very first poem that appeared in the newspapers. I'm looking down. I'm pausing slightly because I'm looking down to find the page. It was It appeared in the very first issue of the Union on September 27th, 1862, and it was republished in 1865 with some very slight modifications. The author was a gentleman named Henry Louis Ray. There's a great biography of Henry Louis Ray by Melissa Daggett. He was he worked in a hardware store, and he was also a soldier, but he was best known in the New Orleans community as a spiritualist medium. He received communications from the dead, and he translated them to inspire his fellow citizens. And I
saw him in Jackson Square.
Okay. Perhaps.
No, that was
there was a rage
for
that. There was a rage for that kind of thing in the 19th century too. So he's
absolutely
acting in line.
And New Orleans was
There are always mediums out there reading your palm and stuff in Jackson Square. So.
Right. Well, this was a bit more organized as an effort and part of a wave of new religion that was sweeping Europe and the Americas, Brazil, at the time. So he published several of his poems in this volume refer to past historical figures and their legacy for the betterment of humanity. And that's certainly the case with this poem called Ignorance. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 short, no, I got to turn the page, 9 short quatrains. So would you like me to read the whole poem or just a small selection?
Yeah, whichever you prefer. Yeah, I think we could sit for 9.
Okay, they're short verses. So this is Ignorance or L'Ignorance by Henry Louis Ray. So here I go in French, and then I'll come back with the English. C'est le mal de l'humanité. C'est le ver rongeur qui l'épuise, ce qui de tout temps la maîtrise et muselle la liberté. C'est par ces lois que Galilée, en instruisant, est accusé, que la science est ravalée, l'absurde divinisé. C'est par arrêt de l'ignorance que Jésus, l'apôtre divin, subit une ignoble sentence en voulant le progrès humain, que Jeanne d'Arc, Socrate et d'autres, Christophe Colomb, Swedenborg, de la vérité les apôtres sont ou raillés ou mis à mort. Oui, dans le monde politique, social ou religieux, comme dans le monde artistique, l'ignorance trône en tout lieu. C'est l'éteignoir de la science, la cause de tous nos revers. C'est l'enfer vrai de l'existence, le seul Satan de l'univers. Mais ce siècle de lumière, à sa barre, veut juger tout, et notre raison, libre et fière, pénètre maintenant partout. De ses assises solennelles sort l'arrêt de la vérité, liberté, paix universelle, bonheur humain, fraternité. Qu'importe si le canon gronde, si partout s'entr'ouvre un tombeau, c'est le départ d'un mauvais monde, l'aurore d'un autre plus beau. And I will follow up with the English. And there's one stanza in particular that I'll want to comment on in relation to translation strategies. So here is the English of Henry Louis Ray's Ignorance. It is the bane of humanity. It is the gnawing worm that feeds that which in all times impedes and seeks to muzzle liberty. Galileo stood accused because its laws were applied, as his science still refused and utter nonsense deified. It was by decree of ignorance that Jesus, our divine witness, received a wrongful sentence for wanting human progress. That Joan of Arc, Socrates, and other apostles of truth, Swedenborg, Columbus, were either mocked or put to death. Yes, in political affairs, in religious and social domains, as well as in artistic matters, unchallenged, ignorance reigns. 'Tis the hand that snuffs out science, 'tis the cause of each and every loss, the true hell of human existence, the sole Satan in the cosmos. But judgment will come, clear and loud, from this enlightened age of ours, for reason rising free and proud increasingly extends its powers. Its solemn courts will soon release the terms of truth's decree, freedom, universal peace, happiness, and harmony. What matters it that cannons roar, that all around an open tomb yawns? For 'tis the end of one bad world, as another, much more beautiful, dawns. And there you go.
That's truly a poem for our time. Man, that is applicable.
As far as science being denied, or what were you?
Yes, ignorance. It's and the reason it applies is because the same white supremacy they're fighting against is what we're fighting against now. And it just works itself out in really weird ways, like people running out and burning their masks.
Sure.
Because a scientist or a doctor told them to wear one. You can't tell me what to do.
I think
right.
I think, Bruce, that Henry Louis Ray, where he reincarnated in 2021, would certainly look around at these behaviors and think, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, right? The more things change, the more they stayed the same, certainly.
Right.
So as far as the translation
But I
question,
like that. Read that
Yes.
last couple of lines again, if you would, because something struck me, and I'm going to bounce it off on y'all's head after you read it.
The very last stanza, correct? It's 4
Yeah,
short lines.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
one of my favorites. And I'll make a comment about the cover of the book and the design in relation to this very stanza, because this stanza inspired the design of the cover and some of the graphic elements inside. So the last stanza reads in English, "What matters it that cannons roar, that all around an open tomb yawns? For 'tis the end of one bad world as another much more beautiful dawns."
It's almost like that old Enlightenment imperative, that we have within our power to make the world anew. That's what I was thinking of when I heard that.
And it also fits with its time because it's probably written during the Civil War when the cannons are booming. But a new world is coming rather quickly, and New Orleans is one of the key places it comes because we have an educated, group of free people of color who can take the lead in Reconstruction locally, which most states did not have that kind of advantage.
It's also one of only a handful of places in the Civil War where Lincoln lived to see his own plan for the Reconstruction implemented. Because remember, he's assassinated in April 1865, but before that, New Orleans had already been captured and occupied. So New Orleans and I think East Tennessee and a handful of other places were some of the very few areas where you get to see the Lincoln Reconstruction as opposed to the one that comes later. And you get kind of a picture of what that what it would have looked like, what it did look like, and what it might have looked like down the road.
All of that is extremely relevant for this poem, for Ignorance, and for a number of the other poems, and certainly your remark, Bruce, about the cannons roaring. I mean, it's not an abstract thought. That's what he's talking about. So you are right on. And as far as your comments, Stephen, about this Enlightenment idea, that is very present. And what I wanted to bring your attention to when I referred to the stanza is the very explicit reference to enlightenment, the intellectual enlightenment. So in the French, this is where I had to do some a little changing. I want to go back to 2 lines so that listeners will think, well, what does it mean to not translate literally so that it actually makes sense? So the French says, "Mais ce siècle de lumière, à sa barre veut juger tout." Now, very literally, that means this century of light, by its measure, wants to judge all things. But I translated that as judgment will come clear and loud from this enlightened age of ours. Now, why did I do that? Because in French, the Enlightenment is called les lumières, the lights.
Right.
Okay, that's literally what it's called. So if I were to translate century of light, I'm not referring directly to the Enlightenment, whereas in the French, it's specifically referring to the Enlightenment, even though it's written in the 19th century and it's the 18th. And then there's some other changes I made just to make the poetry have more punch. But that was an instance where if I wrote this century of light, that would literally be what it means. But then in English, we would lose the reference to enlightenment. So that's why I called it this enlightened age of ours. So
I always thought it was so appropriate that the two French film pioneers were the Lumiere brothers.
I thought so too. Yes.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that's just. I always thought that was. It was kind of funny in a way, and yet it was so appropriate too.
It's. I mean, did they grow up just thinking we have to do something that involves light? I mean, clearly.
I have a side question for you. We hadn't really found a clear answer to yet, and obviously, when the Union took over New Orleans, liberation started for slaves. But when was that task completed so that, everybody under the Union control was actually free? Was that because the one guest we talked to about it said it was like a leaky sieve, but it just gradually. But I didn't know what the end point was when nobody is a slave anymore.
Right. So the leaky sieve is correct. So anywhere that there was a Union presence nearby, enslaved people would leave plantations, farms, wherever they were being held, and go there. And of course, as you know, and many of your listeners will know, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to areas under Union control. So my understanding has been that really 1864 is when that kind of really comes through in the Union occupied areas. So it really meant different things in different places. But whenever the Emancipation Proclamation was promulgated, it's it's a symbolic measure in many ways, right? It frees enslaved people that are in the Confederacy. And so there's that, but I think the leaky sieve is probably a good metaphor.
Yeah, there was one woman, I can't remember her name, but she liberated herself, but wasn't able to get her children. And to hold on to their slaves, the family that had owned her and still owned her children ran away to Cuba. And so they started this international lawsuit, which eventually wound up with her getting her children back from
Right.
Cuba. But the details escape me now. Sorry.
No, those are all, that's one of many stories that are part of the multitude of stories that none of them are identical, right? And then of course the definitive abolition in the Constitution was in late 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Just for some of the dates there. So really, you're looking at the period between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment.
Right. The 13th Amendment ended slavery for everybody everywhere, at least on paper.
Exactly.
Although there was still basically serfdom for the freed slaves, at least in the rural areas, because they wanted a workforce to, even the Union wanted a workforce to bring in the cotton and the sugar and all the other crops.
Cheap labor that you can exploit,
So this is an issue
again, like today.
Right, absolutely. And so this is certainly an issue that Mr. Rudenet, whom you had on the podcast, would have read a lot about in the Tribune, because the Tribune took up the cause of laborers who then had to try to negotiate new conditions largely with plantation owners, but in plenty of other contexts as well. And the federal agency known as the Freedmen's Bureau was an important actor for about 4 years in trying to establish a framework for this new labor market. And many of the conditions did